Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. I hope you're having a wonderful day. We're going to begin our discussion of Trail of Lightning with two parts. First part is myth, the second part is fantasy. We're going to take a look at the myth that spawned the subtitle, and we're going to take a look at fantasy broadly described, because one of the things we want to do at the end of this is see if this fits into one of the subgenres of fantasy. One of the things that I wish I could get everybody to be, myself included, is more curious. And to just apply the idea of curiosity, have all of you think about, why is this called the sixth world? Why is the subtitle here the sixth world? Okay, it's called Trail of Lightning. What does the sixth world have to do with anything? And in class, we'll spend a little more time on this than I will in a presentation, but I think it's important to understand that the sixth world is a big part of the Navajo mythology. It's part of their creation story. And their creation story begins with the first world, or the Black World. And like most creation stories, the land is lacking a lot. In this case, it is a small, tight area. It is surrounded by burning resin, and it is populated only by insects. And eventually, these insects gather wings and they find a way to fly and to leave Black World. There's a crack. Locust finds this crack, and Locust allows them to get from the Black World to the Blue World, which cleverly enough then would be the second world. And the second world is populated by birds, and the birds who don't like insects just naturally, or who eat insects naturally, warn the insects not to eat their food. And life is peaceful until the insects run out of food. And then there's a war. And again, in many, many mythologies, the creation myth leads to battles, leads to war. This is a war not between gods, but between birds and insects. And again, the insects are in trouble, and Locust leads them out of the second world, out of the blue world, into the yellow world. And in the third world, or the yellow world, we start to encounter humans, we start to encounter other animals. Everyone speaks the same language. Everything has feet, claws, teeth, and the wings of insects. Humans are somewhat unique in this, in that they can remove their wings the way someone removes a coat. And once again, they start to run out of food. And they needed gifts, and those gifts needed to come from the mountain lion, the wolf, the bluebird, and the hummingbird. And one of the things you'll notice if you look at the art on the slide, and if you look at the number 4 is sacred. It's tied to the 4 cardinal directions. And the myth starts to establish the idea of the sacred numbers, okay, and the sacredness of certain animals, and the sacredness of the idea of a council. And eventually, ignorance becomes a problem. They don't know how to get the blessings necessary to get more food. And so they are starving. And so they start doing what they've always done. They look for a new world. But this time, they can't find the cracks that allowed them to go from the Black World to the Blue World, and from the Blue World to the Yellow World don't seem to exist here. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there are the four faces. And once again, the number four. And First Woman starts leading people out, and the Navajo follow First Woman. The bird people followed First Girl. The animal people followed First Man. And the insects followed First Boy. And you'll notice that there's a warm area, there's a mountain area, there's a cold area. And you notice once again, First Woman, First Girl, First Man, First Boy. The number four, once again, is sacred. And now they are once again in this new world. Other tribes are already there, and the Navajo are told to learn from them. Also, we start getting a dichotomy. And once again, many creation stories have a dichotomy. And this dichotomy is between two things that cannot be the same. In this case, it's the lazy trickster, the coyote, and the hardworking animal, the badger. Those two things cannot be the same. Sometimes it's male and female, sometimes it's light and dark, but in this case, the dichotomy is lazy and hardworking. And then we get the flood. The flood is set up by the trickster coyote, and he and water monster gamble. Coyote cheats. And while I'm on the subject of trickster, I should point out that in many Native American cultures, the coyote is the trickster, but also the rabbit might be the trickster. And as you're reading Trail of Lightning, look for coyote, who plays a major role, but look for descriptions of rabbit as well, and how that may or may not tie into the trickster element. Anyway, Coyote the trickster cheats, and he wins because he cheated Water Monster's fur coat. Water Monster's babies are in the pocket, and when Water Monster realizes this and wants the coat back, Coyote refuses to give it to him, and Water Monster creates a huge flood. The flood threatens everyone, and the water keeps rising, and people need to escape on a bamboo shoot because it's the only thing that's going to grow fast enough. Turkey saves the corn, and Locust is able to create a hole, and Badger and Coyote work together to enlarge the hole so that everyone can get into this new world. Everyone can get into the fifth world. Creatures get in first. The other tribes, the 32 Navajo clans, and again, for the purposes of our reading, take a look, especially in the beginning, the importance of clans. Then there's First Woman. The people figure out that Coyote is wearing a fur coat that's far too nice for what Coyote should have. They figure out that it is Water Monster's coat, and they put the fur coat into a boat. They put it out in the water. Water Monster reclaims his babies, or her babies, and Water Monster never bothers the people again. They are now in Fifth World. Fifth World is the world we live in now. So obviously, and I hope you figured it out as we're going through these worlds, Sixth World is the newest world, and you can take a look at all of the signs of a new world, of a flood, of all of the environmental disasters and the dystopian elements that led to the fifth world, or the sixth world, excuse me. But it's building on this idea that there were 5 worlds beforehand. It's building on the Navajo creation story. Next, I want us to start thinking about what the heck are we reading. A couple days ago, I did the overview of types of novels. This obviously is not a realistic novel. And this obviously even though it's going to have elements of law enforcement in it, is not going to be a detective novel. So let's take a look at fantasy novels, because this is what it's falling into, along with, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the idea of dystopian novels. Fantasy novels get broken down into subgenres and more subgenres and subgenres of subgenres. And so we're dealing with the idea of high fantasy. High fantasy, as you can see by the picture, is the Lord of the Rings. It's a magical environment with its own rules, and it is epic. It is kings and armies and battles, and it is the huge world spanning sort of things. Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, those sorts of books fall into high fantasy. As we're reading, are we dealing with kings, armies, and battles? If we are, it's high fantasy likely. If we aren't, what are we dealing with? Low fantasy. Low fantasy is the real world. It exists. Magic happens and stuff comes to life, or other sorts of things change it, the real world. Toy Story, I think, is a fine example of low fantasy. And you're dealing with this idea of the toys coming to life, Buzz Lightyear, etc. Is that what we're dealing with in the Trail of Lightning? Contemporary fantasy, Harry Potter, I think, is one of the prime examples of this. You have a real world. You have a plane between the real world and the magical world. Magical creatures break the plane. Sometimes there's some crossing over. Harry crosses over, running through the magic little column pillar in the train station. Those sorts of things are part of it, but there's magic in one side, real world in another. The twain don't really collide very often, although Voldemort does make war on the real world. Harry Potter, I think, is a fine example of contemporary fantasy. Again, is that what we're dealing with? Think about it as you're reading. Mythic fantasy, the roots are in myth, the roots are in other folklore. It draws on tropes from myth. If you read Neil Gaiman's American Gods, all of the Norse myth is in there. It references other myths, and you have the fight between myth and tech coming together in this spot in the middle of Kansas. Percy Jackson is another example. They're not retelling of myths, okay? They're taking the Greek myths and they're putting it into the modern world. Percy is the son of one of the Greek gods. As you keep going, there's also the same author also wrote Egyptian myths with a contemporary twist coming into the real world. And there are lots of books. My Instagram feed is full of, Can the Gods Text? And there's a series based on a character dealing with the Norse gods texting him. Those sorts of things are all in the mythic fantasy. They draw on the tropes of myths, the hero, the heroic quest, all of that sort of stuff. And the myths come to life in the real world. Urban fantasy. It's an urban environment. There's a hidden supernatural underworld. There's lots of pop cultural references. Buffy the Vampire Slayer probably fits into that. There's also a rural fantasy, which gets us into a rural environment. There's a hidden supernatural element, usually dealing with more of the forest creatures and things like that. But urban fantasy, rural fantasy, is that what we're dealing with? As we're reading, think about all of the things that come together. Is there a hidden supernatural underworld? Are there pop cultural references? What are we dealing with here? Contemporary mythic urban fantasy? Certainly, we're not dealing with epic kings and armies and large battles. We're dealing with gods and myths. Um, you know, there's roots in myth, the Navajo stories. There are pop cultural references. I'll point out a lot of them as we go. And there's the club that we talk about later on in the book, or that we'll discuss later on in the book. Is that enough? Is there this plane that we can't break? What exactly are we dealing with? And one of the things you will be asked to do as we're going through this novel and as we're going through the detective novel that follows is try to categorize it, break it down, and explain to me in a paper what exactly is this book? What category does this book fall into? Okay, so I hope that this was a helpful intro into Trail of Lightning. I hope you're enjoying the reading. I hope to see all of you in class next class period. Have a good one.